everyone for having me. Oh, I'll just so as Simone mentioned, I'm from the Disability Housing Centre. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen because I usually have a bit of a PowerPoint that I go through just to talk a little bit about what we do. So let me do that now. Okay, so everyone can see my screen? Yes. Perfect. Okay, great. So yeah, thank you again for having me this morning. So I work for the Disability Housing Centre and we build specialist disability accommodation, which is abbreviated to SDA. So usually my presentation goes for about 30 minutes, give or take, and we can, you know, if anyone has questions at the end, definitely ask me. But yeah, just for the period of the presentation, if you can stay on mute, that would be great. I'll also be emailing through a copy of the slides to Simone or Stacey. And so if anyone is interested in receiving a copy of the slides, you'll be able to receive a copy. So just a little bit about what we'll be covering off today. So just starting off with a little bit of information about who we are and what we do at the Disability Housing Centre. Then going into what is SDA, who's eligible for SDA, and then the difference between SDA and SIL. And then just a little bit of a roadmap to SDA. So we'll just briefly cover some of the steps involved when applying for that SDA funding. And then falling into where you would go to find an SDA property and just some helpful resources as well. So firstly, just a little bit about us. So we partner with a company called Sda Smart Homes. So Sda Smart Homes and the Disability Housing Centre, we're basically the one team really. Sda Smart Homes are responsible for finding investors who are interested in investing in SDA properties. And that sales team will provide guidance on locations that we would recommend building and the style of floor plans that we would recommend building. And from there, at the Disability Housing Centre, we basically are ultimately trying to find tenants for our properties. And just community engagement. So getting out, educating people a little bit about SDA and letting them know that it is an option for some people. We often try and connect with hospitals and support coordinators just to explain that process in a little bit more detail. In my team, I've got, well, it's mainly myself and Angie who are employed under the Disability Housing Centre banner. So our contact details are listed here. So again, you will be emailed a copy of this slide, so you'll have a copy of our contact details for anyone who would like to have a chat following on from the presentation. If you don't necessarily want to ask questions during this time, you're welcome to give me a call later on, and yeah, definitely happy to see how we can help. So what is SDA? So SDA, as I mentioned before, it stands for Specialised Disability Accommodation. It's basically the bricks and mortar, so just the actual house itself. So the physical home that has disability supports integrated into the building of the home, and it's designed so that it wouldn't need any home modifications. So everything's well thought out. It's designed for people with extreme functional impairments, and so that's all taken into consideration when designing these properties. And they do actually have to meet certain criteria under the NDIS in order to be eligible and approved as being an SDA property. So the idea of an SDA property is to maximise independence for our tenants as much as possible through various features found within the home, such as smart technology and automation. So these houses do have to have provision for smart technology, so the houses are all wired accordingly. As an example, we have set as a standard in our homes, we have automated blinds, lights, air conditioning. There is provision for additional things to be automated, such as door automation. That can be definitely done, but it's not set up ready to go. So our properties, they're all wheelchair accessible, including the en-suites and kitchens. They're all wheelchair accessible. All of our properties have emergency power, so if there is a blackout in the area, our tenants will still have access to power. For some of our tenants, that is quite crucial. And there is capacity for on-site overnight support. So our properties would typically have 24-hour support. So under the NDIS, if someone is deemed eligible for SDA, there are different categories of SDA that someone may be approved for. So the different categories are listed here. So we start off with our basic. Now that one is actually being phased out, so not really so relevant anymore. So you'd then be really looking at your improved livability SDA funding. So this requires a reasonable level of physical access and enhanced provision for participants with sensory, intellectual or cognitive impairment. You've then got fully accessible. So that's housing that has been designed to incorporate a high level of physical access provision for people with significant physical impairment. Then you've got robust SDA, so that's designed to incorporate a high level of physical access provision and resilient but inconspicuous materials that can withstand heavy use and minimises the risk of injury and neighbourhood disturbance. And then you've got the highest form of, or the highest tier of SDA funding, which is the high physical support SDA funding. And that provides a high level of physical access for people with significant physical impairment and requiring very high levels of support. So there are multiple SDA providers out there. We're not the only ones, and each provider will typically have a different focus. At the moment, all of our completed properties are built to the high physical support criteria of SDA, so they are at that highest physical access sort of level. But in saying that, it's always good to know that we can look at accepting other tiers of funding as well. So if someone came to us with fully accessible SDA funding, yes, we can definitely look at moving them into one of our properties, and often improve livability. We can look at housing options for them as well. But just with that last point, good to know that it's the physical home and not supports provided by the people. So as I mentioned before, it's purely just the bricks and mortar. So at the moment, all of our completed SDA properties are shared houses. So they are based on having anywhere from one housemate through to about 3 housemates. And we take tenant matching quite seriously when it comes to that sort of shared house environment. But there are other providers that have built other options as well. So apartments and independent villa style options. So it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have SDA, you need to live in a shared house situation. But for some of our tenants, it is quite, I guess, daunting, the idea of living alone. So they do like to live with, you know, have 1 or 2 housemates anyway. So it's really based on the individual and what housing option you're wanting to explore and what you've been funded for. But there are different, there's definitely a variety of different SDA options out there. In the new year, we will, as a company, we will actually have some apartment projects as well. So we do have some improved livability apartments that will be completed in the Nunda area, so just north of Brisbane. So we will look to have in the new year some more variety in what we offer as well. In terms of locations at the moment, for us, our properties are as far south as Logan region up to Hervey Bay. So we have properties anywhere from Logan to Hervey Bay at the moment. So if you're interested in hearing about our locations, just let me know later, and can definitely give you some information on that. Now, I've just got a link here to a bit of a walkthrough. We do often hold open home events which enable and provide people the opportunity to come and actually walk through one of our SDA homes so you can experience the features you'd find. But for the meantime, I'll just try and take you through to this virtual tour just to give you an idea. Can everyone see this virtual tour? Oh, sorry, Simone, can you see the virtual tour now?
No, I can't actually.
Oh, okay. So you can just...
I can just see the link, that's all.
Okay, all right. Maybe I'm not... Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I'll be able to guide you through that then. But again, you will have a copy of these slides, so anyone in their own time will have the ability to go onto that link and guide themselves through. You just basically click on the room that you want to look at, and it will sort of highlight what you would find in an SDA property. So in terms of SDA eligibility, really the two main criteria that we're looking at is someone who either has an extreme functional impairment and or very high support needs. So when submitting an SDA application, really it's about providing all that evidence to highlight that you would sort of fall under that one or two of those sort of categories. But just some things to note here, it is NDIS funded between the ages of 18 to 65. If someone is approved for SDA prior to their them being 65 years old, then it will be with them for life, that funding, but you do have to at least have applied for it before you turn 65. So after you turn 65, unfortunately, at this point in time, you can't apply for the SDA funding. So you would typically have a support coordinator that would help and guide you throughout the process. They play a pretty critical role in gathering the evidence and submitting the application. So for an SDA application, it can be quite a lengthy process and quite overwhelming, but your support coordinator is really there to help you throughout all of that. Just a note as well, it's a very niche funding stream under the NDIS. So they say that approximately 6% of people who are on the NDIS will be eligible for SDA funding. So it's a very small percentage of people. And so a lot of the time, someone won't unfortunately be funded for SDA, but there is definitely a need for SDA, and we are seeing more and more people approved for it. So at the moment, I think the most recent statistics we've seen was that approximately 1,650 people in Queensland currently have SDA funding in their plans. So it's quite a small number. Over the next couple of years, we will definitely see an increase in those numbers. So I think by about 2023, they're expecting that number to increase to approximately 7,500 people. And so even with appropriate housing supports, if you're eligible for SDA, it would typically mean that you would still need help with various tasks such as getting out of bed, moving around, preparing meals, and completing personal care tasks and accessing the community. Just a note at the bottom there, we've just made a note that most young people in residential aged care are eligible for SDA. Now, that's not to say that everyone in aged care under the age of 65 is eligible for SDA, but it's just good to know that often they are, or it's often at least worth exploring that SDA option for them. So what is SIL? Sometimes there is a little bit of confusion around SIL versus SDA, but SIL stands for Supported Independent Living, and basically it's the support team who are in the house providing the supports to our tenants. So they're in the house providing 24/7 support to our tenants. So we have multiple, you know, a range of different SIL companies that come in our properties and provide the support to our tenants. But yeah, they are a completely different company to us. So we don't provide that. We purely build the house and then they come in and provide that support. So just covering off briefly, just some of those steps when applying for SDA. I won't go into these steps in too much detail because it can be quite complex and it's not always, you know, set in stone. But if you have a support coordinator and they're helping you through the SDA application and they need some further help, feel free to let them know that they can reach out to us and we're happy to sort of help them through the steps in a little bit more detail. But really, you'd be the first step is identifying a housing goal at the top there. So there is a form on the NDIA website that would be completed. It's about approximately an 18-page document. It sounds daunting, but it's fairly simple questions that you would complete. And once you submit that, the NDIA are then able to provide funding to explore housing options. So they would provide funding for support coordination hours and for allied health as well. So your support coordinator would work quite closely with yourself as well as with allied health, so in particular an OT, to really identify what housing is appropriate and gathering all that evidence to put forward as an application. So the OT would really assess the Sda eligibility and identify which category of Sda funding they believe their client would be approved for, and then they would really have to create a report, so a functional capacity assessment it's often referred to as. So they would need to create that report and really provide all as much evidence as possible to suggest that their client requires this form of housing. And so once everyone's confident that they've got all that evidence, it would then be submitted to the it would be then submitted and you'd then be waiting really for a decision by the SDA panel. So it's really hard to give a time frame. That time frame can range and it can take quite some time. So just bear in mind this whole process can sometimes be a fairly lengthy process before you really get to a point where you can start looking for your home. But once a decision's been made, it will outline to you what funding you've been approved for. So whether that's the improved livability or the high physical support SDA funding, it will let you know the style of dwelling that you're approved for. So whether you're approved for an apartment, 1 resident, whether you're approved for a house, 2 residents, it will identify that. It will identify the region that you're that you can look at. So if you're interested in Brisbane and Brisbane region, then you'll be approved for that Brisbane region. And then at the end, it will also highlight the actual dollar value that equates to as well. But once you've got that decision, that's when you can really start going out and confidently looking for a home and really knowing what style of home you can look for. And then if all goes well, you'll find a home that you love, you're happy to move into, and then you're then moving in that property. So when it gets to a point of that you're ready to find an SDA home, this page here just lists some examples of where you can go to find an SDA property. So that first one, the NDIA SDA Finder, that's quite a recent website, I guess. Well, it is actually part of the NDIA website, but yeah, it is quite new, so you're welcome to have a look on there. Other than that, Housing Hub and GoNest, they're really well-known platforms that you can also have a look on. They're basically like real estate style websites, but specifically targeted towards disability related accommodation. So not just SDA properties, you can look for just SIL only properties, ILO properties, so you can look at other properties as well, but you can also filter that. When you're creating a search, you can filter your search to SDA if you want, and also the category of SDA that you're looking at, and then you can also filter it down to the region that you're looking at as well. So then you've got disabilityhousing.com.au. That's a very similar website to Housing Hub and GoNest as well. And then at the bottom there, we've just included our website because we advertise all of our vacancies on our website. And it's always, if you are in connection with any actual providers, whether it's ourselves or anyone else as well, you're obviously welcome to reach out to those providers as well. Really, we should all be advertising our properties on the Housing Hub and GoNest platforms anyway, but sometimes it's worth reaching out to us anyway, because we may be aware of upcoming projects that we haven't quite started advertising yet, so we can at least talk about some of those projects as well. So as I briefly touched on before, with apartments and villas, it's not so crucial, but in terms of any shared house SDA properties, tenant selection is something that you know, is obviously you need to keep in mind. And so if you are reaching out to any SDA providers, it's probably worth you asking them what their tenant matching process is. For us, we do take it quite seriously. It's quite a crucial component to making sure we get a happy household. So once we've got a first tenant that has moved in, we work quite closely with the tenant, the SIL provider, to see what they're looking for in their future housemates. It does sometimes mean that, you know, filling a whole house can take some time, and sometimes the first tenant will be there for a little while before we can find that second and third tenant. But it is important that we get that happy household. So we are happy to support any meet and greets between potential future housemates, or anything that we can do to sort of facilitate that. We're happy to do. So as I mentioned before, with SDA, it's quite a niche funding stream, and so not everyone will be funded for SDA. So we've just included some other options that you might need to look at if SDA isn't necessarily right for you. So there is SIL only funding as well, which is funding for that 24-hour support. It's just not necessarily that you're funded for an actual purpose-built house. Then there's ILO funding, which is stands for individualised living options. That's a reasonably new concept to Queensland, but it offers flexibility for people to sort of live where they're interested in living. And then just having drop-in supports, well, both informal and formal supports for various times throughout the day when they most need it. So it's not necessarily that 24/7 support that's required, but they do need still some daily support. Yeah, there's some, I guess, some housing options or funding options that you can also talk about and explore with your support coordinator as well, if you don't think that necessarily SDA is the path that would sort of suit you best. Just some helpful resources. We've included an SDA advice line, so that's a phone number that you can call for further advice if you need. There is also the Summer Foundation website that has some really good helpful resources, and they often have educational webinars that help further explain SDA. So worth having a look on their website if you're interested. If you literally type in the Summer Foundation into Google, it will bring up their website. We've just made a bit of a list of some allied health professionals, so OTs who we've experienced have some experience and success in writing SDA reports. Obviously, their report is a very crucial component to the whole application, and so making sure that you've got an OT who has that SDA understanding is quite important. SDA is still a reasonably new thing in Queensland, but we are sort of now seeing more and more OTs are getting that experience. And so that's the end of my presentation. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now, and then happy to open up to any questions if anyone has any.
Just a technical question, and you may not be able to answer. How do you provide emergency power?
So there's a diesel generator on site that has, it can keep power going for, it's about up to 48 hours. You'll still have access to power.
Yeah, no, I'm just, when you look at diesel generators, they say that they have to operate at least 30% or something of capacity continuously. But most of the time, power consumption in the house during the day is considerably, it's like often down to 0.3 of a kilowatt hour, and otherwise the generator is going to burn out. So I'm just interested in the technical side of how they manage those sorts of constraints.
Yeah, good question. Unfortunately, I probably don't have too much information on the technicalities of the diesel generator, but I'm sure I could probably get some information through to you if you're quite interested in knowing more about that. Yeah,
I'm certainly interested in setting up something. I mean, I've got solar power, but obviously the battery will run out of this prolonged bad weather and blackout. So I'm just interested in some sort of other backup.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm happy to try and get a bit more information on how they, how they work, and get that through to you. That's okay.
Okay. So Ashleigh, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. I know you mentioned that it was a lengthy process, but on average, what sort of time frame do you sort of see from sort of start to being approved for funding? Just average, just to give people a sense of, you know,
rough. Yeah, look, I'd probably try and say, you know, give yourself, you know, you probably want to allocate maybe almost close to a year for the whole process. It may not take that long. Sometimes it might be like a 6-month process. Typically, from our experience, they do sort of seem to fast track people who are in hospital or in aged care. So sometimes those applications are fast tracked, and sometimes they can sort of be a couple of months. But from what I'm seeing, I'd probably say on average maybe about that 6 month time frame. But you might want to sort of allocate a little bit more time. Because you know, if you take 6 months and the decision's not right, and then you need to sort of appeal for that, you know, sometimes you can be looking at almost like a year. But yeah, hopefully it wouldn't be that long. Like that is quite a long time, but in some situations you might experience that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm also interested just with regards to the high physical. So obviously with our MND clients, that would be the category of property that we would be looking at. I've had some experience recently just whereby you mentioned having some blind automation. So that was definitely in your property, but this particular property I was looking at didn't have any of that, didn't have door automation. So is it up to each provider, depending on what's actually, you know, there's a baseline, obviously, that the NDIS ask for, but then do some providers actually, you know, provide over and above that?
Correct. So as a base, all any provider with the high physical support SDA, they have to have provision, as in the house has to be wide correctly to allow for that home automation, but it doesn't mean that they actually have to have any home automation features sort of ready to go and set up. So we just have the blinds and the aircon lights all set up as a standard, but that's not necessarily something we have to do. That's just we've decided to do that.
Your choice. Yeah. Okay. And what about hoist? Is there a provision for hoisting?
Yes, so they do have to have provision for ceiling hoists. Not all of our tenants need ceiling hoists, so they're not actually installed ready to go, but they have to have like the strengthened ceilings to allow for the extra weight. So yeah, there has to be the ability to have ceiling hoists.
Okay, all right, that's great. All right. And sorry, just my last question is just with regards to concierge, for want of a better term, seems to be a term that's been bandied around a little bit at the moment.
Yeah.
And that NDIS aren't funding that any longer.
So there is so particularly you'll find in apartment SDA properties, that's when sort of the concierge model will sort of be relevant. In our houses.
Sorry, I should jump in here. Andrew, Sam and John, concierge is basically having a service on hand ready for you to access, should you require it. That's what that concierge is.
Yeah, and so in our houses, we just have the 24-hour support. We don't, you know, go off a concierge model, but in apartments, that's probably typically where you would find it, because usually with the tenants who are living in SDA apartments sometimes have a little bit more independence and don't necessarily need that 24-hour support, and so they just have a concierge sort of on call for when they need it. But yeah, typically we're seeing the NDIS push back on sort of that one-to-one support funding. So they're more really funding people to live in shared houses than to live in those sort of apartment complexes. Not to say that, you know, if someone goes for an application, you know, we're definitely still seeing some people be, you know, receive their funding as to live alone in an apartment, and then that concierge model would be applicable, but there's definitely a lot of pushback, and more of the funding we're seeing is for people to live in a house with 2 to 4 residents.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions?
Not at the moment, no.
No? Okay. Well, I think we might wrap it up there. So I'll
That's very good.
Sorry?
I said that is very good, Simone.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, we'll just say thank you, Ashleigh, very much for providing all of that information today. I think that's great, and will be most useful for other clients that jump onto the webinar at their own convenience. So I might just, if I can fine.
Well, yeah, if you usually continue this meeting for a little bit longer, I'm happy to sort of jump out and leave it to you. But yeah, as I mentioned, I'll send through a copy of the slides so you can do that in your own time. And then, yeah, just reach out to me at any point if anyone wants to discuss it further, has any questions or anything like that, and happy to help.
That's great. Thank you, Ashleigh.